what Macron is doing when he's saying that he will recognize the state of Palestine, but that Urgence Palestine, should not be allowed to carry out its important work, is an attempt to divorce the Muslim from the idea of pro-Palestinianness. So to say there is an okay way to call for the liberation of the Palestinians, and it's this very secular idea. Yeah, to whitewash it. The idea that Muslims are invaders in Europe, that they come late to Europe, that they are violent, that they're civilizationally different. So all these things that we could trace through something like Samuel Huntington's Class of Civilizations. The problem is not, is this tree true or is it not true? This idea that everything gets its truest meaning at its ancient point of origin. The way the story of the fall of Rome is told, there are various different kinds of invasion of Rome. There's East and West Rome, but the one thing that seems to have caught the popular imagination more than anything else is a thesis by a Belgian historian called Henri Pirenne. It's in a book called Muhammad and Charlemagne, because the thesis is that it's Muslims, the coming of Islam, that causes the fall of Rome.
Thank you for coming, Chella. It's a pleasure to meet you and have you on my channel.
Thank you for having me. Assalamu alaikum. It's great to be here.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. So, Chella, I've seen some of your works with different organizations, and you're an activist, you're also a philologist, and you also, you've contributed greatly to the community, and you said that you're going to France next week for this dissolution to challenge the dissolution, Urgence Palestine, correct?
That's right. Yeah, yes. Urgence Palestine, yeah.
So today you wanted to talk about the Eurocentric narrative that pushes Islamophobia. Can we understand that? How can we understand that? So please let us, inform us.
Yeah, so shall I maybe say the thing that makes the connection between all the different aspects that you've just talked about? So I'm, as you said, trained in the study of the ancient world. The term that's used for that is usually a classicist, but I'm trained in what's sometimes called classical philology. So that's to say Greek and Latin languages and literature. I am also, as you said, involved in activism, particularly for Palestinian liberation. That's been a kind of constant in my life, but obviously since the 7th of October, because a number of other activities around that have sort of picked up around then, and also because various Islamophobic and genocidal, or at least genocidal accomplice governments have been attempting to stop various activisms around the liberation of the Palestinians. That's become this kind of huge part of my life and also of my work, which I think has been difficult for many people to understand because classics as a discipline, that's to say the Eurocentric discipline that studies ancient Greece and ancient Rome, has found it very difficult to speak out about the genocide of the Palestinians. We are one of those disciplines, like many other disciplines, where many of us, me included, have been enormously disappointed by the fact that academics and professional organizations have not been able to condemn the genocide of the Palestinians. There's been this kind of what I see as a sort of moral cowardice around, being able to call a spade or a genocide. And that, I think, has sort of had a huge impact on my work because Palestine is, of course, among many other things, a place where enormous amounts of archaeology, ancient archaeology and archaeological work go on. It's, a place that where there's enormous numbers of ancient sites. And so it has this fascinating position for people in the study of the ancient world of being at the center of what many of us do, in fact, but also, even as those ancient sites were being destroyed, by Tel Aviv, and destroyed in a way that has been called historicidal by Tel Aviv. So that's to say, trying to think about genocide as something that's also about not just removing a people, but removing the connection between a people and their history. And the reason for doing that's very, very clear. I say this, about 10 times a day at various different protests and things. But the reason for doing that is very clear. The reason for doing that is because if you look at the long history of Palestine, what you see is that it has always been multi-ethnic, multi-religious. And if you are a settler colonial state that wants to say this is a state only for a racialized group of people, that's to say Israeli Jewish people, you can't say that and also have conscience of the long history of this place. That simply won't work. So you have to, if you like many settler colonial projects have to do, particularly, European colonial projects have been famous for this. You have to control the ancient history of the place, which means you have to delete, all that evidence of multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-racial history. So this has kind of become increasingly a part of my work, because I was someone who was sitting here thinking, okay, well, I'm trained in this discipline that knows the long history of this place, because the Romans were there and whoever else was there, knows also the problems of colonial archaeology that still affect the narratives that are produced around the history of Palestine. But can also maybe, from this position of being trained in this very Eurocentric discipline, can maybe sort of twist that Eurocentrism on itself and try to use it as a weapon. So that's how I got involved with the project that you mentioned, which is, inshallah, going to take place in France next weekend, sure. Which is a kind of large group of academics, scholars, activists of various kinds who are coming together to stand against the French government's proposed dissolution of Urgence Palestine, which is one of the major pro-Palestinian or anti-genocide campaign groups in France. But there are a number of other kind of sordid ways that the French government is trying to not just control Muslim populations in general, but trying to Islamophobically persecute those Muslim populations that would want to stand against the genocide of the Palestinians and to organize themselves, politically in other ways too. So there's a kind of big rassemblement, is I guess what we're calling it in French, a kind of gathering together of people next weekend to try to protest that, but to protest it with ideas. I think that's the important thing. I think we have learnt something, or I've learnt something maybe as an educator since the 7th of October, which is that protest is an incredibly important place for education to happen. If you think about the numbers of people who, even 2 years ago, 3 years ago, would have thought that the term settler colonialism was sort of academic jargon or some kind of esoteric, thing that academics or historians only talked about. And now increasingly, we hear the chant all the time about Israel being a colonial state. And this is not academics who are saying this now. This is now everybody increasingly being able to say that. So some learning has gone on here, about that coloniality. And it's this huge kind of public learning project. So I'm sort of excited in a way. I'm obviously horrified that there is such a genocide that makes it necessary that we have to carry out this work. But I'm sort of excited really for the future of education if we understand political protest, and particularly, political protests that are driven by those who have been colonized, by Muslims, by folks of color. This is really kind of huge solidarity movement that is also a very educational one.
Can I?
So, yeah, absolutely. Stop me.
Okay, I'm sorry, because I want to understand. So you're going there, and just recently we have talks about Macron wants to recognize the Palestinian state, but at the same time he is undoing some of his works locally within France. So what is the reason to dismantle an organization, pro-Palestine organization here, which is not advocating for genocide or ethnically cleanse the other population, the settler population? It's just about equal rights. So why is he undoing the work here and then trying to recognize Palestine abroad? So what is the purpose, and who is actually involved in shedding light on dismantling this organization? So are there any affiliated parties, organizations that try to discredit this organization? So if you know, can you share with us?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in contemporary France, nor do I belong formally to this organization. It's something I became involved in as a kind of intellectual solidarity, I suppose. But I'll say it kind of the way I see it, which, as you rightly point out, there's something paradoxical about the fact that Macron is on the one hand threatening to recognize the state of Palestine, on the other hand, dissolving these organizations. And I think we have to think about the question of or the position that Muslims are in France at the moment. And remember that the Palestine Solidarity Movement, although it is not only Muslims, there are, of course, also large numbers of anti-Zionist Jews and various other groups of people involved. Mm-hmm. But it is often recognized as a kind of Muslim cause, right? If you go into a mosque, you're suddenly in a space where the idea that Palestine will, inshallah, be free is not a contentious position in the way that in other social groups it might be more of a contentious position. So there's some kind of Muslimness, politically speaking, to this pro-Palestinian cause,
which is weird because from the words, from what I've heard, like in the messages, there hasn't been a call for Palestine vocally yet in France.
Certainly not enough. That's true. Certainly not enough. I think there has been.
How are they associating only to a Muslim cause? So there's definitely. What do you call there are definitely players who were trying to push a certain narrative, and you were talking about intifada, like how some Zionist organizations in one of the other podcasts, how some of these Zionist organizations were pushing a particular kind of narrative. So that's why I'm asking you, are there players here who are trying to push to discredit Urgence Palestine?
Yeah, absolutely. I would even say it's not so much individual players, although, of course, when I was speaking on the other podcast that you heard, which is on the Adnan Hussein show, I was speaking about the term intifada, and I was talking there about the trial of Elias Dimzalen, who's a anti-genocide, anti-Islamophobia, pro-Palestinian activist in France. And I was sort of explaining the way that Islamophobia has motivated that trial, but also specifically Zionist organizations, have been involved in pursuing that trial. So there certainly are these kinds of various organizations doing this work. But I think the context here is really state Islamophobia, because I think what Macron is doing when he's saying that he will recognize the state of Palestine, but that Urgence Palestine, should not be allowed to carry out its important work. I think what's happening there is an attempt to divorce the Muslim from the idea of pro-Palestinianness. So to say, there is an okay way to call for the liberation of the Palestinians, and it's this very secular idea. Yeah, to whitewash it. And it's the idea of humanitarianism. It's the idea of, we are now reaching a point, and you hear politicians say this a lot, we have to ask whether Israel has gone too far. That's been an occupation that's gone on more than 70 years. The point at which Muslims were asking whether it's gone too far, and pro-Palestinians more generally were asking that, has been that whole 70-year period, since that occupation began, supported by, Britain and those European powers. So the idea that politicians are only now saying, well, has it gone too far? Should we do something? That's an attempt, I think, to rewrite the history of Palestine, and also to describe the problem as if it were only a kind of humanitarian problem rather than being a political problem. And where I think that kind of is underlined by this state Islamophobia is that state Islamophobia is a fascinating thing, right? Because on the one hand, you've got kind of two options, I think, if you're a Muslim in France at the moment. One is you integrate, and I'm using that word in kind of huge scare quotes, you integrate, that's to say, you treat Islam as if it's a religion on the model of Christianity. You privatize it. You don't wear your headscarf. You don't wear your beard. You don't show it openly. You turn it into something that you do privately in your own home. That means you also don't build community with other Muslims, because we've seen other, Muslim organizations in France have their assets frozen and, these kinds of things, which is an attempt to stop them from organizing collectively. So that's one option, is you kind of secularize your own Islam and turn it into something that is seen as being kind of compatible with the French state, which also means that you don't critique French colonialism, because, of course, remember, French colonialism was also against, in the majority, against Muslim populations. We talk about those policies that became Islamophobic policies. In the UK, we talk about those being first used against Irish people. That's to say, in that colonial context where Britain was occupying Ireland. In France, they were being used in Algeria against Muslims. So the history of French colonialism is also the history of French Islamophobia. They're the same thing. So that's your one option, is you cede, all of your political power. You treat Islam as if it were a religion on the model of Christianity. You only practice it privately. You don't make it part of your organizations, your communities. Your other option is you say, no, Islam demands more of me than that, right? It demands that I be anti-colonial. It demands that I organize my community. It demands that I do things like organize schools or run charities or, develop that kind of community. That is also political work, right? Once we're doing that community building work, the political has become almost sort of bad word to use, I think, but that is all political work. But if you do that, the French government is going to call you part of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's the recent report that was just released. It's going to call you Islamist. And what's happened is that word Islamist has now been understood as shorthand for Muslims who are not subservient to European colonialism and to Eurocentrism. So, and if you do that second one, the French government is going to make your life extraordinarily difficult, right? And I think what's so dangerous then, or what the government sees as so dangerous about movements like Urgence Palestine, is related to this educational work that I was mentioning to you at the beginning that I think the pro-Palestine movement has done, which is to plug the pro-Palestine movement into all of the other anti-colonial movements, which in the French case were anti-colonial movements, in the majority organized by Muslims in places like Algeria, for example. Mm-hmm. So I think it's that sense of anti-colonialism, and specifically Muslim anti-colonialism, that Macron is trying to distance from the pro-Palestine movement by saying, look, we all want there to be food for the Palestinians, but actually, I'm not sure. Of course, we all want there to be food for the Palestinians, but I think we also want a free Palestine. I think that's something different to just wanting Israel to treat the Palestinians a little bit better. Do you see what I mean? Do you see the difference?
Mm-hmm. So, sorry to digress, but just here's a question: is it because we are in this situation because we never held the perpetrators, let that be in Vietnam, let that be in Palestine or in Algeria, we never held these people accountable who perpetrated, whether that be genocide, whether that be war crimes. Is that the reason there, because of no accountability, we have let this a snowball effect?
Well, I think that's part of it, but I think there's also behind the question of accountability is also a question of the way that, coloniality or Eurocentrism, which is in my mind a sort of intellectual counterpart of coloniality, behind, the question of accountability is the fact that the world is still structured in a colonial way, all the ways, and this is my current book project at the moment, is to try and think about the way that this Eurocentrism and this coloniality structures how we think about ancient history, specifically in Islamophobic ways. Mm-hmm. But I think when we think about how the world is organized, whether or not we've had, on the face of it, condemnations of coloniality or apologies for genocide and all these things, whether or not we've had those kind of surface level things, what we have never had, I think, is any attempt to change the racist, colonial, Islamophobic, Eurocentric system to something else.
That's exactly what I'm addressing as well. Because I've criticized this personally here, but let's take the UN organizations. Mm-hmm. And what sanity did people consider, first of all, the permanent members, but also if you look at most of the organizations, the legal heads, let that be WHO, let that be UNESCO, let that be UNICEF, except for two organizations, one is UNRWA and the other one is UNHCR, except for these 2 aid organizations, every other organization is either in America or in Europe or in Australia. And this treats like as if other countries, even we're talking from a developed or secure. If security and development is the criterion, I think Singapore is much more developed than New York City. But what creates the premises that these are the countries that would handle the legal structures? Mm. So not just the permanent members, but even the legal heads, like WHO. It doesn't make any sense. And with what consciousness are people still, holding on to the UN? Because people hold on to this human rights, or I don't get it. Like, don't you think it's because of accountability in this case? Because, yeah,
I actually think it's because of history. I'm a historian, so I would say that. But mm-hmm. I think it's because we've created a world where the idea that Europe and the West is not the civilized guarantor of everyone's freedom is actually unthinkable. Right. And we could talk about specific instances where we see that narrative play out. But I actually think it's something much bigger than those individual narratives. I think it's the story we tell about history. The story that we've always told about the very beginning of history is a story that, in my work, I call it classicism because I'm interested in its most ancient instantiation. But I'm interested in that ancient version because of the way that it structures how we think, about the present. So this idea that Europe is kind of naturally superior in all ways, more civilized, more historical, more likely to guarantee everybody else's freedom, which flies in the face of the history of how Europe has always behaved, right? Mm-hmm. The idea that these colonial powers should be the guarantors of people's freedom is ludicrous. But the way that story is built is, I think, on a narrative of history, right? And that narrative of history, if you'll allow me to just tell it briefly, goes something like this, right? It runs basically parallel to the story we tell about ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So the story that I call classicism basically is that in the ancient world, a great ancient society rises. And the paradigmatic example is Greece and Rome, but other for reasons I might explain later, other places around the world have now tried to find their own Greece and Romes to weaponize Islamophobically. But we'll come to that in a moment. So Greece and Rome rise, right? Greece and Rome are, positioned as being kind of superior to everywhere else. They can write, they have democracy, they, all these various things. They invent the theater, they invent philosophy. It doesn't matter to anyone that they don't, of course, invent any of those things. I mean, that's the idea that there was only the Greeks that had any form of democratic government is a wholly silly idea that, I say all the time, of course, that's not the case, but everyone wants to believe that's the case because this is the guarantor of European supremacy.
It's also the term. It's not about the idea, but it's about the term because democracy, both of them Greek words. So yeah. It's to not to steal, but to claim that word. Yeah. Like I think in the other podcast you were also giving examples like philosophy and also philology. Yeah. These are terms that are claimed by the European civilization using the Greek words, which kind of emphasizes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As if there could be no concept of philosophy outside of the Greek word philosophy, right? As if there's no other. And philosophy is the important one because if you're the inventors of philosophy, that also makes you superior thinkers, right? So there's a kind of civilizational superiority which allows you to dehumanize everyone else. So you have this great ancient society, right? And it leaves traces into the present. And if we follow through, the story of Greece and Rome, basically that society weathers many things. We fight the Persians, we fight off, in terms of the Romans, various groups, let's say the Germans, whoever it is. But
can I pause you for a second?
Yes.
You said you studied in Oxford.
Yes.
Your bachelor's, because I also did philology for bachelor's, and then question, you had philosophy, am I correct?
That's right, yeah.
What did you major in? English philology or?
No, so I read classics in English as an undergraduate, so mostly kind of literary study, and then my PhD is in
no, bachelor's. I'm talking about your undergrad. Yeah. So philosophy, because when we had philosophy, we started with Greek, of course, but then we went towards the West. We started a bit to the southeast, southern parts of Europe, and we went towards the West. So how was Oxford? How was the curriculum in Oxford structured?
I think that is, that trajectory of philosophy is basically the canonical trajectory of it. I mean, there are now various courses that would try to teach something called world philosophy, right? Which basically means we add, some Sanskrit text in translation, or we
never had that.
But that hasn't really shifted the dominant narrative of kind of Eurocentric philosophy. Mm-hmm. But the thing that really, I want to finish my story of classicism just because the really important bit is what happens at the fall of Rome. Mm-hmm. Because the way the story of the fall of Rome is told, there are various different kinds of invasion of Rome. There's East and West Rome, all those various details. But the one thing that seems to have caught the popular imagination more than anything else is a thesis by a Belgian historian called Henri Pirenne that he wrote in the 30s. And that's the thesis. It's in a book called Muhammad and Charlemagne. And as you hear the title, no doubt you can hear where this is going, because the thesis is that it's Muslims, it's the coming of Islam that causes the fall of Rome. And this becomes this structure where, Muslims end Rome, end antiquity, end European antiquity. It doesn't matter that this antiquity is not at all European. The Romans were not only in what we would now call Europe, of course not. But that's the idea, is that this is kind of Europe's great ancestor, right? It's Greece and Rome. And this is all ended by the coming of Islam, right? Mm-hmm. And what I think is fascinating about this narrative is the way that it still is absolutely at the heart of almost all Islamophobic discourses that we could think of. The idea that Muslims are invaders in Europe, that they come late to Europe, that they are violent, that they're civilizationally different. So all these things that we could trace through something like Samuel Huntington's Class of Civilizations, or various other kinds of civilizational thinking or kind of Islamophobic racist texts. All of that is really premised, in my view, or at least in the view of my book, is premised on this idea that it's Muslims that cause Rome to fall, which becomes then, a way of explaining all of ancient history, including places really far from Europe. I had the opportunity this year to go to Great Zimbabwe, which is an archaeological site just outside of Masvingo in Zimbabwe. And the story, so that obviously the site is famous because Cecil Rhodes, that's to say the British colonizer who gives the name Rhodesia to Zimbabwe, Cecil Rhodes ordered various archaeologists to go there. And what he was interested in was that they should find that Great Zimbabwe was not built by Black Africans. He had actually told them before they went there that they had to find that it was built by the Phoenicians. Why did he want it? So that's, the Phoenicians are a kind of maritime people who lived around the coast of North Africa around the same time as the Greeks and Romans. Mm-hmm. And the reason he wanted them to find that this was built by the Phoenicians was because then he could prove that it was in fact colonizers that had done, who'd built this great thing in ancient Zimbabwe, and that would provide a justification for British colonization. But the interesting thing, related to what I'm saying here about Islamophobia being premised on this narrative, is the narrative that those archaeologists that Cecil Rhodes sent to Great Zimbabwe came back with was that this great ancient civilization, that had arisen in this ancient past, had been superior in terms of writing, philosophy, all these things. It had only fallen at the point when Islam had come, right? It was Islam that had ended this great civilization. So in other words, what Cecil Rhodes did was he patterned the story of ancient Africa onto the story of Greece and Rome in order to present the idea, that it was not British colonialism that was damaging to the ancient history of Zimbabwe. It was in fact the coming of Islam. And various archaeologists, including Timothy Insall, but various archaeologists have pointed out that actually there were no Muslims in that region at the time when Cecil Rhodes says there were, but Muslims become this kind of scapegoat for, ending these kinds of great ancient civilizations. And we see that narrative now replicated all over the world and causing, in my view, this global Islamophobia that is spreading. So in that sense, this kind of Eurocentrism that causes Islamophobia is not just about overrepresentation of Europe or any of these things. It's actually about how Europe tells the story of the history of the world, I think.
So you give an example of a Belgian historian, I don't know. Which century is it from, if I can ask you?
He was writing in the 1930s, Henri Pirenne.
1930s. Okay. Because I do understand, like, let's say you take the example of the Dante's book or Gothe. You get the idea of, like, pressure, right? Like, you have, the Catholic church that oversees your work, and they want you to portray Islam in a certain way. So, did this Belgian historian had, like, peer pressure or academic pressure that he had to write his paper in a certain light?
Mm-hmm. So, I don't think there was anyone, sitting there saying, "Do this or I'll shoot you," kind of thing. But I think we shouldn't undervalue the role of epistemology here, because I think, and this is something that, if it was up to me, if I could shift the way that we thought about Islamophobia, the way I would shift it is I would want us not to think about it as what I would call epiphenomenal. So in other words, not to think about it as resulting from other phenomena. And this is how we normally explain Islamophobia, right? We say, well, the Americans want oil and that's why they hate Muslims. Or we say, well, there's economic crisis in Europe, and so people are blaming that on Muslims, and that's why people hate Muslims. So that's what I mean by epiphenomenal. There's another phenomena going on, and Islamophobia comes about in response to that. I actually don't think this is epiphenomenal. I think Islamophobia is epistemological. And by that, I mean, I don't think Piran even thought that this was particularly hateful to Muslims. He probably didn't know any Muslims, when he was writing this. So I don't think he was I don't think there was anyone saying to him, there's a material benefit to you doing this. I think that's how we often read Islamophobia. I think it's more that this was the epistemological world that he was enclosed in. I think the idea, that Europe is simply the best thing in the world, or, this historiographical narrative that I'm presenting where Islam is the destructive force that causes the end of great European civilization and, every other great ancient civilization. I don't think we should see them as kind of engineered for material gain. I think they seem simply to be unavoidable, for people who use them. And we know that because that's still the case now. There are still certain ways that Eurocentrism has organized the world that it's impossible for us to think outside of at the moment. A good example of this is nation states, right? Mm-hmm. We live in a world where the nation state is pretty much the only category anyone uses to think about how, the political organization of countries and states, right? And yet, you don't have to go back that far. In fact, back as far as 1924 to find the organization of the world into a caliphate. And we know that a caliphate was different to a nation state because when the threat came that the caliphate would fall, we had Muslims in India writing to Muslims in what became Turkey saying, we want to defend the caliphate. They weren't living under the caliphate. Mm-hmm. They wanted to defend it because they saw it as somehow oppositional with a Eurocentric world order. And so we are still now locked into some of these ways of thinking where, no one now will talk about. People will say, if someone asks me, for instance, let's take an ancient city, the ancient city of Ur, for instance, right? The ancient Sumerian city of Ur. Tell me where in the world that is. What they're asking is, which modern nation state would that now be in? And I have to say something like, it's in what's now Iraq, for instance. I can't say, well, it's just north of the boundaries of the caliphate. There's no other shape for me to talk about those political organizations in. And the fact of narrowing those kinds of examples, that's the fault of Eurocentrism. That's what it means to be locked into this Eurocentric epistemology. And that's what I think Piran was locked into.
Mm-hmm. So what is the significance of, this narrative? What happens?
Well, essentially what you've got is a kind of grand narrative for history that, as I've already explained, with the example of nation states, it structures the kind of categories we have for thinking about the world. But I think the most important thing that it does is it causes global Islamophobia on my reading because it allows us to position Muslims as always coming late to the history of the world. So you end up with this world picture where everything that's good about the world gets its origin or tells at least a story of its origin that comes from antiquity. But if that antiquity, that ancient world, is defined by the fact that it's pre-Islamic, it comes before Islam, and also by the fact that Islam ends it. So Islam is kind of its destroyer, right? It's in confrontation with it, according to that narrative. Then you've essentially written Muslims into a position where they have no genuine claim to nation or to any kind of really any form of identity or belonging, right? And we see that in contemporary Islamophobic discourses. We see, for instance, French...
Rohingya.
Yeah, exactly.
Not just here in Europe, but also in towards Rohingya, whether that be India, whether that be the East as well, like Uyghur. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Every genocide currently ongoing against Muslims is, in my opinion, motivated by this idea that Muslims come late to their land. So you're right, Rohingya, the Uyghur. I mean, the Uyghur are a really good example of this because not the French government, that was a Freudian slip. The Chinese government, although the reason I said it's a Freudian slip is because there are shared techniques across these various types of Islamophobia. Mm-hmm. But And the Chinese government explicitly, in a relatively recent, only a couple of years ago, white paper about the Uyghurs, they explicitly explained this as a problem of history. They said that the Uyghurs are trying to distort history. And so the idea is that the Uyghurs can't be as ancient as the Chinese state because the Chinese state understands itself to have this relationship with ancient China that the Uyghurs don't have because the Uyghurs are Muslim. So the Uyghurs become this kind of late coming aberration or imposition on China. But the Chinese state itself is not all that old, right? And this is the interesting thing, is that contemporary nations position themselves as having these ancient ancestors that they don't allow Muslims to have. The same is true in the genocide of the Palestinians, right? We see Tel Aviv trying to make the case that there is a kind of ancient Jewish presence in Palestine that not only predates Muslim presence in Palestine, but makes that Muslim presence illegitimate because the Muslims are understood as coming late, to the history of Palestine, even though, as everybody knows, the idea of Israel as a state is really not that old at all, right? This is the project from the 1940s. So, and there are similar kind of very interesting examples around the world, but the way this works for the genocide of the Palestinians in particular is really, really important because this becomes justification for genocide against Muslims. In other words, if you can't tell a story that says that you have an ancient presence in a land, you are going to be vulnerable to genocide from those who can tell a story about ancient presence in that land. And, that's really why this matters, because when we talk about Islamophobia, we're not just talking, although we are talking too, but we're not just talking about things like employment discrimination or schooling or lack of access to medical care or right to wear the hijab or wear the beard.
Existential threat itself, not
yeah, we're talking about existential threat. Where that global Islamophobia ends up, if we allow these nation states to tell a story that Muslims are outside the boundaries of nation because they don't have an ancient ancestor, because they come after Rome, then we are essentially, allowing them to justify genocide against Muslims. So, I really think this is really important. I think it's also important because it allows us to draw a through line through all of these genocides to see that the Palestinians are not a one-off. This is not a question of one situation. This is a question of the way that a story of history is functioning against Muslims worldwide. And we see it in Europe too, not explicitly so genocidally, but, we see the French government, for instance, saying that Muslims have another allegiance beyond the French nation. So there's this idea that, Muslims are not part of the nation in the same way. We see it in anti-migrant and anti-refugee discourses, for instance, the idea that, like the Muslims versus the Romans in the narrative that I'm trying to diagnose here, the idea that, refugees come and they're kind of planning to destroy the civilization, destroy the way people live. This idea that coming late to a nation makes you oppositional with that nation. That I think is very much, part of this Islamophobic historical narrative of classicism that I'm describing.
How does the nation state is in conflict with the latecomer narrative? Like, I didn't get the whole picture. So if you can explain that a little bit here.
Yeah, so I'm going to explain it using the example of Saudi Arabia. And this will be confusing, no doubt, to some listeners, because there will no doubt be some listeners who think, oh, well, how could Saudi Arabia be, using this Islamophobic narrative of history when Saudi Arabia is a majority Muslim country? So I'll explain that in a second, but let me first explain this question of nation. So the state of Saudi Arabia is as old as 1932. Right? That's important. It's not an old state. It's around the same age as the so-called state of Israel, actually, interestingly. But it's about as old as 1932, right? For a long time in Saudi Arabia, it was not possible to do very much archaeology. Most ancient archaeological sites were closed, and they were closed. I mean, small bits of archaeology did go on, but they were closed. People couldn't visit them because of the idea that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had in a hadith stated that you should not go to one of the ancient archaeological sites that's identified now as the site of Hejra. Whether it really is Hejra that the Prophet ﷺ was talking about or not, that's a different question that you would need a Islamic studies scholar to explain. But this was the idea, was that the Prophet, peace be upon him, had been against the idea of going to these ancient sites. Mm-hmm. For that reason, ancient sites in Saudi Arabia were closed and people did not go and visit. Small numbers of people did visit, usually kind of Western tourists. And when they did go, they would report seeing signs that said things like, discover Islam rather than discovering the ancient past and these kinds of things. So there was this idea that it was somehow un-Islamic to visit these ancient sites, and the sites were closed. And that was, there were various, the ulama, the scholars had made various pronouncements that this was the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. Whether or not we agree that that's right or wrong, that's beside the point. I'm trying to say this was how it was, the dominant way that it was understood. Very recently, because of a project that's known as Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, which is a project of kind of rejuvenation of the Saudi state. It's about national identity. But as part of that project, something very interesting has happened, which is that the archaeological sites that had so long been closed on the grounds that Islam was against them being opened, those archaeological sites are now being opened up. And they're being opened up specifically with tourism, especially from the West, being driven to those sites. There's huge amounts of work from the tourist board being done. But this is Vision 2030 is a government policy that includes explicitly, for instance, putting money into festivals so that people can go at these festivals to see these archaeological sites, and having contemporary artists design statues inspired by the statues. And statues is even particularly interesting because of the long-held idea that there shouldn't be, figurative representation. And again, we can argue about whether that is or is not Islamic, but that was, for a long time, the dominant sense. But there are now, all these installations of kind of statues, including of women, in places like Al Ula, where there is now a festival that is also about this kind of ancient heritage festival. So this is a huge turnaround, from the Saudi government. And it has been greeted, from the West at least, with, huge acclaim. Many Western archaeologists are very happy about it because they see this as a kind of westernizing on behalf of the Saudi government, or modernizing, or, all of these terms that get used. But I think we have to ask the question, why are they doing that? Why now? Why are they doing this? And part of the answer is that these archaeological sites are what's called Nabatean. That means Nabatean is the name given to a group of ancient people, roughly again contemporary with the ancient Greeks and Romans, who lived, around kind of what is now Saudi Arabia, not only Saudi Arabia, but kind of around that region. This is the same ancient people as Petra in Jordan. So it's they're around the same age, the archaeological sites. But Saudi is now, really loudly kind of driving all of this tourism and all this scholarly work towards these archaeological sites. And you have to ask the question, well, why are they doing that? What's going on here? And how is it related to this Vision 2030 project, which is explicitly a nationalist project? It's about the idea of, creating the idea of a Saudi identity specifically.
I mean, even the national song, right? Like, although, what do you call? They invited a foreigner to create a national song for them. Yes. Yeah,
exactly. There's huge amounts of energy around the idea of nationalism in Saudi Arabia at the moment. And this kind of archaeology is really part of it. But when you look at, the sort of discourse, how this is being written about, it's absolutely fascinating because we are talking, not we, the Saudi state is talking about these ancient sites as if they were proof of an ancient Saudi national identity. Now, given everything I've just said, this is a state that was born in 1932. There cannot be national Saudiness. It's an idea as old as 1932. But yet, here is the Saudi state trying to say, before you were anything, before you were Muslims, you were Saudis first and foremost. Mm-hmm. Now, given the conversation we've just had, no doubt you can see this is exactly how Europe uses Greece and Rome. Yeah, that you were Greek before you were anything. That's what makes you European. This is exactly, the way that many nation state projects are using their ancient history. And it's explicitly directed against the idea that Islam is your primary category of identity. The idea is to give you an older category of identity. I'm saying that in scare quotes because, as I've explained, it's not in fact older. That's the story that's being told. But to give you an older category of identity that's going to supersede your Islam, so that Islam becomes, much more like a sort of diminished religion or diminished religious category that is only one part of your identity. It's not the main part of how you define yourself, because that's going to be your national identity.
Secularized version of religion, like more like
exactly.
closed doors. So like religion is inside the four boundaries, four walls. So
absolutely.
I get that picture, but you did mention about the existential threat that the narrative that the West is pushing, or the Western, let that be not just the West but also China. So how does that become an existential threat if we're taking the example of Saudi?
Well, it becomes an existential threat to Muslims in particular. First of all, because it diminishes Islam and turns it into a sort of secularized or a Eurocentric notion of religion, right? Many scholars have written about this idea that the category of religion as a kind of post-Christian idea doesn't actually suit Islam all that well, because sure, Islam might be about religion, but it's about much more than that, right? It's about political community, political ideas. It's about how we organize the world, really. Mm-hmm. But this kind of nationalism, this nationalist history kind of diminishes Islam so that it's only religion. So what that does is it stops the idea of political Islam. So it stops Islam from being something we can organize with politically. And it sort of domesticates it, right? It turns it into something that is at the whim then of nationalism. And you can see the parallel with what I was explaining about France earlier, that, France is also in the process of trying to depoliticize Islam to turn it into a religion that doesn't have any power. So where that becomes existential is because it stops Muslims from understanding themselves in a relationship of political solidarity with Palestinians, for instance, or with the Uyghurs, or with the Rohingya, and that's why I was bringing up the question of the nation state versus the caliphate, because what is, the crucial thing about the caliphate is that even Muslims who did not live under the caliphate saw themselves as being politically in solidarity with the caliphate. And I think this is really the idea of the Ummah that's being disarmed here. The Ummah is this idea that Muslims have a political solidarity. That doesn't mean they always agree with each other about everything. It means that there is a way of organizing the world that they are all in solidarity around. So, the Palestinian cause is a really good example of this. There are very few Muslims, even though there are a number of Muslim states that should be doing an awful lot more than they are doing for the Palestinians. There are very few Muslims who, when you talk to them, when you meet people in the masjid or whatever, there are very few people who would say, oh yes, it's right what Tel Aviv are doing to the Palestinians, or, Tel Aviv need to be doing that. No, almost no Muslims would say that. Whereas if you said that in any other gathering, there would be people who would say those things. So in that sense, you could say the Palestinian cause is an ummatic cause. It's part of how Muslims express themselves politically. And what happens when we get these nationalist histories that try to displace Muslimness as a political organization is we stop being able to organize that ummah. We stop being able to, to mobilize that ummah in defense of those who are finding themselves, genocidally at the mercy of nationalism.
And is it, do you think Saudi has adopted, like, it's not just Saudi, like maybe the most of the Gulf countries have adopted because of the, the Eurocentric narrative, they absorbed it unconsciously, or is it because they purposely choose that route?
Well, I think we have to be careful not to see nations like people, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't think we can sort of unpick, what were they thinking when they did this? I think maybe a better way to think about it is, what do they gain from doing this? Or why are they doing it? And the answer to that question...
I'm asking you that question because remember when you told me about this Belgian historian? Yeah. Because he was within this echo chamber.
Yeah.
He couldn't see beyond it. So that's why I'm asking you, because of the claim that Europe has, educating or civilizing the rest of the world? Is it because of we have lived in that echo chamber and that we kind of like absorbed it, or is it? Are we? You're rightfully so, like, seeing what are the gains, but is it like subconsciously absorbed? So that's why I'm asking you that question, because it can be subconsciously absorbed that we're not looking beyond, or is it purposeful? That's why I'm asking. Or purposeful could be hard to say.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
I know what you mean. I think
You
the answer
you take the example when MBS in one of his interviews, he said, like, we want to build Saudi like Europe, and clearly suggests, like, he could have said Andalusia, he could have said Bosnia, and all of these examples he just
could have said the Ottoman Caliphate,
the Ottoman Caliphate as well.
Yeah,
but
he would never have said that. But yeah, I totally get what you mean. I think the answer is, again, Eurocentrism. The answer is the European Renaissance. So, when I'm talking about what Saudi is doing, I'm not saying Europe had a real claim to antiquity and Saudi is fabricating a claim to antiquity. Europe had no real claim either. We are not in Europe in any kind of real sense the descendants of the ancient Greeks and Romans. It's just that claim was made early and it was made consistently and it was exported around the world through European colonialism, right? I think if you think about that history of European colonialism and the way that it allowed Europe not just to dominate the world in a kind of military or economic sense, but to position itself in an epistemological sense as really the only sort of civilized presence in the world, but also the only one in control of the way that everybody thinks about everything. I think in that sense, you can kind of see why Saudi is doing it. And that's because it really is, it seems like the only way that you can have, any kind of control about how people think about anything. There are almost no other examples of how you take that kind of epistemological control. So in that sense, it sort of seems unavoidable, except that for Muslims, of course, it's not unavoidable, because for Muslims, we also have, this history of something like the Ottoman Caliphate, for instance, also an incredibly powerful presence that was organized entirely differently to the way that European modernity or European colonialism organized itself. So I think what we haven't done, and what our job as historians, I think, should be, is to try to find those examples of different ways in which Muslims organize things. And I don't just mean caliphates or nation states. I'm using that as kind of shorthand for all of the different ways that Muslim societies were organized, that Muslim histories were organized, that Muslim politics was organized, for instance, because that's what's being sort of deleted by Eurocentrism. At the moment, I think there aren't enough other options, other than the way that Eurocentrism has organized the history of the world. But it's very much my work in the second half of my book. The first half is to describe this narrative of classicism and how it's organized against Muslimness. The second half of the book is to try and think, okay, so what alternatives are there? What alternatives might there have been? And to look specifically at, projects of Muslim political organizing, or ways that Muslims have tried to organize the history of the world differently, to curate different kinds of relationships with antiquity, for instance, that would allow us to think against, this kind of Eurocentric control. But I think at the moment, Eurocentric control it's not something that people choose to go along with just because they think there's something in it for them or something. It's so powerful because it seems like the only way you can think about something, I think.
Yeah, at the end of the day, people want to see something tangible rather than theory, right? You need to see practical things. That's why you have the theory and the practical thing. So what are the implications if this is not challenged? I mean, I know that you've touched on it, but you wanted to talk about that implication in Europe. So what are the implications of
in Europe? Yeah, so I think I've already mentioned global genocide against Muslims. That's the existential threat of this narrative of history. I think in Europe, what we're seeing is what seems like a softer version, but it's this kind of hollowing out of Muslimness in order to make it, these kinds of integrationist narratives that want Muslims to prove themselves as kind of good neoliberal European subjects. And lots of Muslims, unfortunately, are involved in that kind of performance. And what I think is really sad about this is you can perform the kind of, what is sometimes called the good Muslim, right, after Mamdani's book. You can perform that kind of integrated European secular Muslim all you like, but still, there are cases in France, for instance. I keep going back to France. It's kind of the key Islamophobic example for me at the moment. But there are cases in France of a woman coming back from the supermarket saying assalamu alaikum to her neighbor, and suddenly the police stopping her and claiming that she's doing something Islamist, by saying assalamu alaikum. So even if you play the game of trying to show yourself to be as secular, as European, as you possibly can, as faithful to the idea of nation, having no animosity around the question of having been colonized, for example. Even if you play that role, you are still going to fall foul of these Islamophobic policies, because there is no way, and this is the interesting thing about the word Islamism and how it's being used in Europe at the moment. It has been hollowed out of meaning. Nobody knows what it means. It's attached to images, but no meaning, right? Everyone can imagine an Islamist. You can see them in your head, right? The bandana, the gun, the black jumpsuit, they're driving a Jeep somewhere, through a desert. Everyone can attach images to the Islamist, but it's been hollowed out of meaning to such an extent that no one can actually tell you what Islamists think about anything. And that's a very dangerous situation for all Muslims, because we're then in a situation where anything can be called Islamism and therefore, demonized. You can be imprisoned, you can be dehumanized, put in Guantanamo, all these various things for something that is actually a kind of sliding rule, depending on what the government sees as oppositional with its own policies. So the term Islamism has ended up being, because it's been hollowed out of its meaning, because no one is reading, texts that no one is reading Sayyid Qutb or the kind of intellectual tradition of Islamism. Europe or the West as a project in general needs to see Islamism as something without meaning, as just kind of spontaneous violence that's motivated only by Islam's pathological hatred of the West. And its inability to see that there is actually an intellectual tradition. And that's not to say that all projects, or any project, in fact, that calls itself Islamism today is a genuine reflection of that intellectual tradition. I'm not here defending any project that would call itself Islamist today. That's not my role. But what I am saying is, this thing has been hollowed out of meaning to such an extent that it's just become a stick to beat any Muslim who's perceived to be oppositional with any aspect of colonial modernity, right? And that's the real danger for Muslims, is that we're losing that political tradition of Islam. And with that, we're becoming vulnerable to really any government that wants to hold anything against us. And that's how you end up with ridiculous things like 12-year-old girls not being allowed to wear skirts in school, or long length skirts in school, because they're perceived as being involved with the Muslim Brotherhood, at the age of 10 when they're turning up in the schoolyard, and these kinds of ridiculous things.
Okay. Oh, it's connected with Muslim Brotherhood. I didn't know that. It's just, I thought it was connected with Islam, and they just want to laïcité thing. That's why they banned abayas altogether.
Well, that's the argument. But the whole, the driving force of that argument is that wearing a hijab, is your way of signaling that you're not just a Muslim, because they have to, of course, say, because laïcité is supposed to mean freedom privately of religion, right? Mm-hmm. So they have to kind of say, look, the problem is not that you want to be a Muslim woman. The problem is that, like those who would organize their Islam politically, like Islamists, you want to show everyone that you're a Muslim woman, and that is associated, with the Brotherhood or with whatever it is. So even, totally everyday aspects of Muslimness can become attached to these signifiers like Islamism, because it's been so hollowed out of meaning that it can be used to kind of beat, anybody who's perceived to be doing anything that someone doesn't like.
Is Islam in conflict with Western way of life?
The answer to that depends on what you mean by Islam, and it depends on what you mean by Western. So the way that I prefer to see this is that Islam, or Muslimness specifically, because I don't want to, get it confused with a kind of religious understanding, because I'm not a religious scholar. That's not something I'm at all qualified to speak on. I think that Muslimness offers ways of thinking that can be oppositional with European coloniality specifically. So if you understand the West to be, or at least Western supremacy to be the product of European coloniality, which is really the only way you can understand Western supremacy. But, if you understand it to be the product of European colonialism, then I think that Muslimness is offering ways of thinking beyond the paradigms of European colonialism. And I think it's offering, I think that's why it finds it so easy to organize for the liberation of Palestinians, for instance, because it can do that kind of anti-colonial thinking. I don't think this is essential to Muslims as a religious category. I don't think the minute you say the Shahada, magically you become someone who is anti-colonial. I don't think that at all. I think we have to get away from the idea that these things are kind of essentialized identity categories. But I think that because Muslimness has a relationship with the idea of Ummah, and because Ummah has always been a kind of political organization as well as something tied to the idea of Islam and Muslimness, I think there are kind of alternative historical paradigms, political paradigms that can be used to think outside of the way that the West organizes its history. That doesn't mean, and I wouldn't like anyone to mistake me for saying that, all Muslims are a danger to the West or something like this. I'm talking about the West as an intellectual project. And I'm saying that because there are, of course, Western-centric Muslims. There are, of course, Muslims who think that what the fight against Islamophobia is, or should be, is the fight for Muslims to be accepted as kind of good neoliberal secular subjects in Europe like everyone else, right? And those people, you can tell those people because they will say things like, but the hijab is just a piece of cloth. It doesn't mean anything. It's just like any other item of clothing. Now, sometimes we make this as a rhetorical argument, right? We say, well, why are you treating the hijab differently to the way that you would treat a t-shirt, for instance? Mm-hmm. But I think we need to be careful about doing that, because what we're doing is hollowing out, again, the meaning, because, the history of hijab, first of all, legally speaking, hijab is, particularly in places where there are bans on hijab, it's not just another piece of clothing. Because if you demanded in the street that a woman remove her trousers, for instance, you would be breaking the law. That would be assault, rightly so. If you demand at the doorway of a school in France that a girl remove her headscarf, that's not legally speaking assault. That is completely legal and goes on every single day in schools in France. So those two things are not the same, because the West constructs them, or at least, those places where there are hijab bans construct them differently. But if we say, oh, well, it's just another piece of clothing, what we do is we lose, the specific meaning of these things. And that's how we, we kind of secularize our own tradition. Also, mm-hmm. We depoliticize our own tradition too. So, I think, I think, where was I? I'm saying all this because I'm trying to explain that it depends what you think the West is. Mm-hmm. Because I think of the West, as a constructed idea that is, constructed as a kind of civilizational idea in service of European colonialism.
People who say it, right? Like that's one of the reasons why I asked you that question, because it means different for a liberal versus a conservative versus.
That's right.
So what does it mean? So that's why I wanted to ask you, but you beautifully pointed out every single word. Like are we talking from a colonialist supremacy, or are we talking from different means, right? Yeah. So the next question I do have is, how important is it for Muslims to reclaim that narrative? Because as a philologist, or as a historian, it's important to, rewrite the narrative. So... Yeah. How important is it? What are the areas of necessities right now?
Well, important enough to me to write a whole book about it, inshallah. So, and also an article which is shortly forthcoming in the Reorient Journal of Critical Muslim Studies, which is where people can go if they want to read more about this. But I think it is vital, and I don't use that word lightly. We've already talked about this being an existential threat. At the moment, we can sort of point to the situation of Muslims, in East Turkestan, in Palestine, in Burma, the kind of various ways of pointing to those populations. But this is not something that is just of this moment. I mean, we could talk about Bosnia, for instance, as Srebrenica, as an earlier example of genocide against Muslims that was also premised on the idea that Muslims had less claim to nation. And if we don't write a new history of the world, that's to say a history that's written against this Eurocentric narrative that I've been discussing with you, if we don't do that, what we're going to see is the proliferation of these kinds of genocides around the world. We're seeing it in India at the moment, and India, sorry, I won't do too deep a dive on India, but India is a fascinating case because what's happening in India is, well, you see it in the destruction of Babri Mosque, right? Famously, when people begin their stories about Islamophobia in India, they begin often with the destruction of Babri Mosque. That's not because it was the first thing ever to happen, but it's kind of the iconic moment, right? The destruction of Babri Mosque is precisely this narrative of classicism, or depends on this narrative of classicism, Eurocentric narrative that I've been explaining, because what happens at Babri Mosque is a group of right-wing Hindu supremacists get the idea that this mosque is built on the birthplace of the Hindu god Ram, right? And then they mobilize all these Hindu supremacists, over decades, this is, eventually to go and destroy this mosque. So it's precisely this idea that there's this late coming Muslim thing, and underneath that late coming Muslim thing is this, early ancient thing that needs to be rescued from this late coming Muslim thing. But what's really interesting about India, the reason India is a fascinating example of this, is because if you ask the question, well, how did India get this narrative? The answer is British colonialism. The answer is that when Britain went to India, they told India that they were going to liberate India from these Muslim occupiers of their land, right? So they positioned themselves as liberating kind of true ancient Hindu India from this late coming Muslim aberration, to the point of, and this is particularly for me as a kind of historian of the ancient world and as a philologist, and classical philologists, it's fascinating because what they do, the British, in order to cement this narrative, is they invent a whole load of ancient people that are called things like white Huns, white Parthians. In other words, all these white ancient Indian people. And they also propagate this narrative about languages. So this linguistic narrative that is called, still today, is called Proto-Indo-European, this idea that there's a language group that includes Sanskrit and Greek, right? So this idea that, the true brothers in arms against the late coming Muslims are the Europeans and the Sanskrit speaking or Sanskrit writing Hindu Indians.
So you have this idea of what do you call I know about the language tree that you're talking about, but even within the language, the language tree, you have so many languages. So for instance, I'm from a part of India where we speak a completely different language, which is not connected to the Indo-European. It's not even in the branches of the, and even within that whole tree, you have the Ural, Finno-Ural language branch, and you also have the Turkic, the semantic. You have all these branches. So why do you say it's actually designed in a way where to connect? And yes, definitely, it's a kind of a curious question. Why do they have like two different? One is Indo-European, which is Iranian and all those stuff, and the other one is European, which connects, but it's a prototype. I get that as a question. But isn't it also premised by how language evolves? Like, for example, I don't know the names, but the words changing from b to p and then to f or v, depending. So isn't that premised, like the way a language changes, isn't the tree premised on these, these little things? I don't know the name, but because maybe you might recall it.
No, you're right. So the tree, the idea of the tree is an attempt to describe the relationship between languages. And how is that relationship mapped? Well, as you rightly say, it's mapped by linguistic change, right? This idea that we can trace how languages relate to each other because there are similarities and there are differences and we can map them. I think, and there are various different ways with which philologists engage with that tree. Some people would say, but this is completely objective. Other people would say it's completely not. But you only have to know a little bit of the the history of the discipline of philology to realize that at various points it was absolutely in service of European colonialism. There's a great, I co-edited a book last year that's called Critical Ancient World Studies. And in that book, there's a chapter by a philologist called, a really serious philologist, much more serious philologist than me, called Krishnan Ramprasad. And he talks about the kind of this connection between Sanskrit and Greek. And he talks about, William Jones and those kinds of philologists that went to India in order to create this idea of the relationship between, Greek and Indic languages. So that's the place to go if you want to read about that kind of disciplinary history. But for me, the question is this. It's a very simple question. It's, why did the tree seem like the best image for understanding the relationship between languages? Whose idea was that? And this is an interesting question, because if you think about other people that have used trees or other places where trees are used as an image, you think of, for instance, Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species, for instance. That's where the very famous tree of life image comes from. But you could also think of, for instance, classical inheritance. When we talk about the classical tradition, we're talking about sort of Greece and Rome at the top of the tree, and then all of the rest of Europe and the West, coming down the tree, and everyone who's not Europe and the West somewhere further away, right? And for me, the problem is not, is this tree true or is it not true? The tree is just an image for thinking about how those things are related. But the idea of that image is, again, this idea of classicism, where we have the ancient ancestor connecting with the modern thing, and it's the ancient ancestor that gives meaning and legitimacy to the modern thing, right? So you end up with this idea, and this is an idea that is crucial to classicism, but is also hugely damaging to Muslims specifically, for reasons I'll explain. This idea that everything gets its truest meaning at its ancient point of origin. And just to give you one last example, and then, there are many more examples in the book, but this is the problem with being at this point in writing a book, is you have all of these examples you want to talk about. But it's useful maybe for comparison with what we were saying about Babri Mosque. The one thing that most people know about the relationship between so-called Islamists and the ancient past is that in 2015, the so-called Islamic State, Daesh, whatever we want to call them, destroyed the temple at Palmyra, right, in Syria. That's the most famous at the moment example that people think of when I ask the question, how do Islamists relate to the ancient past? Those examples are quickly what people come up with, these examples of destruction. And then they're related to other examples, for instance, the destruction of the manuscripts at Timbuktu, the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan. Everyone can come up with these examples of moments when Islamists destroyed the ancient past. When people talked about the destruction of Palmyra, of the temple specifically at Palmyra, the ancient temple, they talked about it as if it was, a truly existential question, as if I think people used phrases like the pearl of the desert has been destroyed, as if this piece of what people understood as European civilization had been destroyed by these Islamists. And all the explanations that were given were, people tried to do a very kind of poor religious understanding and say, well, it's because the temple was shirk and that's why they must have destroyed it. Or they came back to this very old Islamophobic civilizational understanding that, Muslims are oppositional with the West. And so that's why they wanted to destroy this thing, because it was Western heritage, right? But the bit of the story that no one ever tells is that Daesh, the Islamic State, were not the first to destroy Palmyra. They were the second. The first people to destroy Palmyra was in 1929, when the French colonial archaeologists, under the French mandate of Syria, go to Palmyra. That's to say, the town that's called Tadmor in Arabic. There's really only classicists that call it Palmyra. But they go to Tadmor, and they go there because they're expecting that they'll be standing there gazing up at this kind of great monument to the ancient West, that they're going to find in the desert. And they're expecting that great monument of the ancient West, that's how they're going to position it. They're expecting that to prove, that the French have a right to control Syria. So it's absolutely involved in this project of colonialism. European colonialism. But of course, what happens is they go there in 1929, and what do they find? Well, they don't find anything classical. What they find is a mosque and a town and people worshipping and going about their lives among the ruins of this ancient temple, because that is how the Muslims who lived in Tadmor were honoring those ruins as they were living among them, right? So what do, these French archaeologists? Well, they decide to create the classical ruins. So they destroy most of the houses. They only leave one house, which is the house that used to be the house of the mayor of Tadmor, and they use that as a kind of repository for collecting archaeological items. They destroy the mosque, almost completely. They move out all of the people in order to create the idea of this kind of abandoned classical ruin standing alone in the desert. So, I'm not saying this to say that anyone's violence against ancient sites or any other sites is a good thing. I'm simply saying if we're going to talk about Islamist historiography as requiring violence, we need to talk about the fact that our colonial Eurocentric narratives of historiography also required violence in order to be created, and that what's actually happening at that site is a contestation around how do we do history? How do we make history? What does this site really mean? And the French colonial archaeologists were arguing, by creating this site, that the most important thing that a site can mean is also its most ancient, right? It's kind of original point. Whereas, on the other hand, Daesh, we're seeing this as a Muslim location that had been destroyed by colonialism, right? And in order to produce this classical, and they were destroying that classical thing that had been produced by European colonialism. So it's actually a contestation, between Daesh's historiographical project and European colonialism's historiographical project. Again, I'm not condoning anybody's destruction of anything. I'm simply saying we have to see these things as reactions to one another. This was not just Daesh being violent out of nowhere. There's a relationship here, a historiographical relationship. And where I think that has bearing on your question about, the idea of the tree and philology is when we understand language and language change to be best mapped as a tree, what we're imagining is that there's an ancient original point, which is, the truest meaning of a language, and that languages kind of evolve from then on to be more different, right, from that point. That's exactly what the French archaeologists in Syria were trying to argue. They were trying to say, look, all of this Muslim life, Muslim relationships with this historical site that are living and ongoing, they're not worth as much as the classical, ancient meaning of this site. So we're going to restore it back, deleting. It had been a mosque for much, much longer, than it had been either an ancient site or a church, which had also been a part of its history. And they were going to destroy all of that in order to go back to its most ancient meaning. That's the idea of the family tree also, right? Is that everything is best described by its most ancient.
We never looked at it from this lens. I think we always looked at the tree with respects to migration, like from where did migration start? I think that's usually the student's perspective when we come into philology and we look at the tree. Because when we learn about the Ural, Finnish, But yes, I do agree with your perspective as well, because especially if you look at Andalusia, the fact that they only went, Europe claims to the south of Spain and all the way towards Greece, it feels because of that Indo-European, tree, right? Even though language has always been, there's always been interaction between the the Northern Africans and Southern Europeans. And language should definitely would have shifted, mix, but we don't see that. Maybe like you say, there is there. I mean, I get the picture from a historical perspective, but from a language perspective, it's still perplexing. So the next thing, you wanted to connect one more example.
No, that was my example. Syria was my example.
Syria was your
That was
example.
the one. There are loads more examples in the book, but we'll be here forever if we go through all of them.
Sure. So, I think perhaps we can conclude here. So, where can people follow you?
Well, I'm on most socials. To find me on socials, you need 6 letters, Luxmea, Luxmea. That's how you'll find me on Twitter, on Instagram, which I'm trying to use more than Twitter at the moment for all the obvious reasons, the same reasons everyone's trying not to use Twitter at the moment. You just have to put gram on the end, so Luxmea gram, so Luxmeagram. You can find me on Blue Sky. Similarly, if you put in Luxmea, you'll find me there. You can find me on TikTok. That's been a new thing for me, is to try and to try and use TikTok more. You can also find me, I'm one of the co-hosts of a podcast called Radio Reorient, which is a part which you can find wherever you find your podcasts. But Radio Reorient is part of the Reorient project. I mentioned the journal earlier. I've also just come back from the conference in Istanbul related to this project. But Reorient is a really interesting project for thinking about Muslimness and history in a kind of post-Orientalist sense, and trying to think about decolonizing ideas of Muslimness. So that's a good place. Radio Reorient's a good place if you want to hear more. As I mentioned, the next issue of the journal, in which I have an article about precisely this logic of classicism and history that we've been talking about, is just about to come out. I think it's coming out, inshallah, at the end of this month. So look out for that. Otherwise, if you have questions, my email is publicly available. I'm easily found, and I like to talk.
Sure. So I'll add them in the description. And one more question I wanted to ask you about this Istanbul conference that you went to, and the Granada conference that you went to. So both of these, can you just give a comment on what was happening and how significant is that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been to two. I've been on a kind of
a tour, rather,
journey around the world of conferences recently. But yeah, the first one I went to was the International Islamophobia Research Association conference. We call it ISRA for short. That was in Granada. I went there for the first time last year when it was in Sarajevo. But this year it was in Granada. That is a kind of collection of globally anyone working on Islamophobia. And it's interesting because my work, because it is rooted in how history, and specifically kind of historiography, how we write history, produces Islamophobia. I always go to that conference with kind of some trepidation, thinking that, it's going to be mostly sociologists and anthropologists talking about Islamophobia from a kind of only contemporary sense. But I always find such a warm audience for the way I think there. And I was this year also on a panel with Hatem Bazian, Reza Zia Ibrahimi, and Adnan Hussein. So people whose work is engaged with history in different ways. So I think that was really meaningful for me, because it also showed me that there are other historians interested in questions of how history produces Islamophobia. And we actually themed the panel around the idea of historiographical Islamophobia, which is what I had proposed last year in Sarajevo to this conference. So that's a really useful, very, very activist, very committed group of scholars who now are sort of, starting to get to know each other a bit more. I think there's going to be a few more outputs of that project as well, maybe some podcasts. So if people follow ISRA on socials, they'll be able to find out about that. Reorient so that's the second conference I went to in Istanbul. And Reorient is I sometimes think of them as kind of my home team as an academic, because that's a place I know I can always go to get really good questions and to have really good conversations. And because I'm involved with the podcast project, I have kind of regular conversations with that group of people. There's also a blog associated with that project that's got loads of really interesting kind of short form writing about the question of critical Muslim studies, which is the thing around which the Reorient project is focused. So this idea of thinking in decolonial ways, in ontological ways, in historiographical ways about the idea of the Muslim. There's also the conference this year. There was also, for the very first time, there was a summer program. So people could come to Istanbul and spend a number of days engaging with these questions around Muslimness, decoloniality, history. And that, I think, was hugely productive. And we had the conference at the end of the program. And what was fascinating was, by the time we got to the conference, people were coming from all over the world, but speaking the same language. And we were able to just make huge advances in terms of how we understand global Islamophobia, but also Muslimness as it relates to coloniality and decoloniality. So I'm hugely, alhamdulillah, I'm hugely lucky to have these scholarly communities. It's not common, I think, for scholars, particularly scholars, decolonial scholars, or, those wanting to work on questions of Islam, especially political Islam, it's not common for us to have these kinds of communities. So I know exactly how lucky I am, and I would very, very much encourage people to get involved with both of those communities. They've been hugely valuable.
Is this only for academics, or is it also for the public to come and contribute or also like participate? So yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it is only for academics at all. Certainly for Reorient, which is obviously the project I know a little bit better, the idea of things like the podcasts and the blog, obviously there's a journal, which is a scholarly journal, although it's an open access journal, so anyone can read it. And certainly when I wrote my article, I was very much aware that because it's open access, I wanted people who are not academics to be able to read it too. Mm-hmm. But certainly that's the point of the blog, is to kind of open up those ideas to non-specialists too.
Sure. So yeah, I think we'll conclude here. Jazakallah khair for coming, and hope to have you again, inshallah.
Yeah, thank you ever so much for having me, and jazakallah also to everybody for listening.
Barakallahu fiqh. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam.